Testing in the back. You guys good in the back? Great. Thumbs up. Now, you guys good in the back? I hear myself. I'll talk louder here the moment I get going. You guys all get coffee so your ears can catch up with how fast I talk?
All right, everybody, thanks for coming. So just as a reminder, please silence your cell phones so that Casey talking is the only thing we hear. And just as a reminder, there's no Saturday morning science for the next 2 Saturdays because of spring break. But Apollo 11 is opening on Friday at Ragtag. And so if you need your dose of science, it's a great movie. It's really you don't realize you're watching a documentary. So the next Saturday morning science will be on April 6th. And this is actually as part of Canada Week. And we will have Canadian author Amy Shira Title, who will be discussing her upcoming book on the Mercury 13, who are the first group of women trained for a space mission that you've probably never heard of. So come and hear about them. So today's speaker is Casey Holliday from Anatomy and Pathology. And Casey says he grew up near Cape Canaveral in Florida with alligators, manatees, and shorebirds. And so he did his undergraduate in zoology at the University of Florida, and then worked at the Field Museum in Chicago for a while, and then got his PhD at Ohio University. And then after a stint at Marshall, he came here, and we're lucky to have him, and I think we'll really enjoy the talk. So let's welcome Casey.
Thanks for coming. There are a whole lot of familiar faces in here. Some of you I've probably seen like 5 times in the last 10 years I've been here. So I'm going to call up volunteers who can give my talk for me. But it's really great. We've got this really great community of folks that are really into kind of paleontology and kind of how heads work and how animals work. And it's good to see many of you all here today. I've had a lot of coffee and I'll get warmed up here and I'll keep talking faster and faster. It's the show. But I'm over in the School of Medicine in this graduate program called Integrative Anatomy, and we're part of the Pathology and Anatomical Sciences department that's part of the medical school. So I kind of wear a number of hats, one of which is I like to do research on how heads work and how animals work and how they've changed over time. So I'm somewhat of a vertebrate paleontologist. My other hat is that I teach human anatomy at the medical school. So I teach the next generation of health professionals how we work and how we work on the inside. And learning our bodies really, really well is good for all citizens. So you can read the bottles of pills and understand what goes wrong with your bodies. You can talk to your doctors and nurses. But it also really helps us understand how other animals work really well. And so in our program over here in Integrative Anatomy, we try to train up all of our graduate students and undergrads on not only how we're built, but then how all other animals work and how they're built and how they've changed over time. It's a really great program, and I hope you guys can check us out. I like dinosaurs and crocodiles and birds. Like Dee said, I kind of grew up beachside Florida, surrounded by exotic animals. Exotic from Missouri, pretty much run of the day in Florida. But this is a picture of basically Big Bend, Texas, around 70 million years ago, in which there's some tyrannosaur here and this big old crocodile here, and then also birds flying around. And we have birds that lived alongside of dinosaurs, which all lived alongside of crocodiles. And this is a really epic picture because there's just great drama going on, and it's really cool. But I like it because it's really showing the epitome of skull evolution from what we really find in reptiles. And that includes these really big, hard-biting animals like crocodilians. Tyrannosaurs are really derived, hard-biting theropod dinosaurs. And then birds have also evolved a series of groups that can also bite really hard, like parrots. If any of you have ever been bitten by a macaw, like one of the really big hyacinth macaws, that can break your wrist if they wanted to because their beaks are so big and they have muscles that are big enough to actually crack bones in our bodies. They're really used for husking nuts and fruits and not biting people. But again, these groups of animals have all evolved into different niches, and one of those niches is biting really hard. And to do that, you have to have a lot of different features of your skulls that allow those things to dish out forces without failing. And I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about how skulls work, and we're going to get kind of in-depth into some really cool science, and then I'll pull back out and hopefully try to talk about why this matters. We can spend a lot of time looking at living animals and recently living animals, but to really know where they came from or through the lens of evolution through which they come, we have to go back and look at the fossil record. And so, you know, if you went out into Utah or Montana these days, you can find yourself picking up the skeletal elements of Triceratopses and T-Rexes and fossil birds, and these are all basically fragments of animals that were once alive at some point on Earth. So at some point 70 million years ago, a flash flood came down the Missouri River at the time and swept up a whole herd of centrosaur dinosaurs, and they drowned and got washed up along the riverbanks. They ultimately got buried, and then erosion has had them kind of come up, and then we find them, right? And then it's our job in some way to piece all this together and figure out how these animals lived. And that's a really fun part of the job, because we can kind of take all these pieces back together again and then figure out their physiologies and figure out how hard they bite or what their muscles might have looked like or what kind of cartilages they might have had, or figure out how they might have used different blood vessels in their skull roofs to heat their heads up. And this is some art we just had commissioned that will be in a paper that comes out in the next couple months, hopefully. And so again, this is the same Aguja formation down in Big Bend, Texas with their tyrannosaurs, or big Deinosuchus crocodiles, and a lonely little bird there, staying warm in the early dawn over a dead Triceratops. My paleontologist friends that like ceratopsians always have artwork that shows a live ceratopsian impaling tyrannosaurs and crocodiles with their horns and things. It's an epic battle. So I'm really interested in archosaurs, and archosaurs are the group of animals that includes crocodilians, non-avian dinosaurs like tyrannosaurs and duck-billed dinosaurs and triceratops and things like that, as well as in modern living dinosaurs, and those are birds. We know that birds evolved from a stock of dinosaurs. They come from a group of little, basically squirrel dinosaurs that are flitting around the trees. They evolved feathers and flight and evolved into the group that we call birds today. So these days when people say dinosaurs went extinct, that's not true. So you can be kind of the annoying person that says, well, you know, actually birds are dinosaurs. But this is fact. And so we can kind of move past that argument these days and really talk about the evolution of lineages and how birds have been around since 140 million years ago, as far as we can tell. They're a very rich clade. They're alligators and crocodilians and their friends have been around for an equal amount of time. And so we see these really amazing lineages of animals trying out different niches in different parts of the world, and then we're left with what we see today. So birds, you know, have a huge amount of diversity. You go anywhere in the world, and there are all sorts of birds doing different things. Crocodilians, on the other hand, are sort of diverse. We only have about 23 living species of them today, 24 with some new genetics that we've discovered about Cuban crocodiles. But crocs are kind of weird in that we're actually seeing a very narrow window of croc diversity. So in the Mesozoic, crocodiles were eating plants, they were on land, they were chasing down animals on land, they were fully marine, they were occupying all sorts of niches around the world. But then after the KT extinction 65 million years ago, we kind of only got left with this group that we have around today. And one of those is the American alligator, which most of you are familiar with. They'll be here in about 40 years, all right? Armadillos are leading the way up here with the frost line, and alligators will be soon to follow. And alligators are actually really weird. We know a lot about them because they're from North America, and so all the scientists here work on alligator because it's the local croc. If we lived in Europe, we would work on Nile crocodiles. If we lived in Argentina, we would be working on caimans. But alligators are really weird. They're actually the most cold-adapted crocodilian, all right? So they're not really like, they're cold-blooded in a way, but they also can tolerate colder temperatures better than a lot of other living crocs. This makes them really interesting physiologically, but also makes them weird compared to other crocs. And so we have this kind of weird model system that we often deal with, and that's the alligator. And we'll talk about how they work too. It turns out that their ancestors, or their nearest ancestors, had very short faces. They had these little snub faces with big crunching teeth that they liked to eat turtles with about 50 million years ago. And the guys we have around today actually have very long faces compared to their ancestors. It's really weird. And maybe if you come back in 3 years or so, I'll have a really good story about how that happened. But this is the relationship of our animals. We have crocodilians down here in blue. We have dinosaurs and birds up here in red, and they all share a common ancestor that looks something like this. And this is Euparkeria. It's a early archosaur from South Africa, so from basically the southern hemisphere continents. And it's got like this big hole in its face, which is part of its nasal cavity. It's called the anorbital fenestra. It's got a big old eye. It's got some holes on the side of its skull here where jaw muscles kind of peek through. And they're largely predatory. We have most of our kind of primitive archosaur animals have big sharp teeth, and we think that they're chasing down other animals to eat. But this group quickly radiated into all sorts of different types of dinosaurs, which then either evolved into birds or we had the croc line that did their own thing. These guys are really cool. Birds and modern crocs are quite different from one another, not only in how they look, but also in how they work. So this is basically an X-ray video of a duck feeding. So there's a little bunch of like duck kibble down here in a dish. And this was a live duck that was filmed with CAT scanners and video, showing basically how the beak moves independent of this part of the skull, and then the mandible's moving, and then this little bone back here, the quadrate bone, is also kind of wiggling around. And this is called cranial kinesis. This means that there are joints in the skull, other than just the one jaw joint, that are moving relative to other parts of the skull. We can't do this. We only have one set of jaw joints here that I'm using right now to talk, all right? And we can move our jaw around. And that's only because we have this one set of joints right here, our jaw joint. On the other hand, birds and a lot of dinosaurs here in the middle, as well as primitive crocodilians, had what we think were wiggly joints in the skull. And this is going to be a common theme throughout the rest of the talk, is how do we know how bones move, or what does it mean to have wiggly bones inside of the head? And why do animals have either flexible heads or stiff heads? Because both sets of these animals can bite hard, but they do it kind of differently. This is a gharial at the St. Augustine Alligator Farm in Florida. It's eating basically a cake made out of fish meal. It looks really yummy. But gharials and alligators and other crocodiles are pretty similar in which they largely, like us, have one big jaw joint in the back, and that allows them to kind of do the Florida gator chomp just like this. All right, so they have one big hinge in the back that allows them to really bite really hard this way, okay? And you can see this gharial kind of doing that. The other thing that crocs are known to do is also death roll. And so if you watch like footage of crocodiles in the Serengeti or you wildebeest, they grab onto wildebeest and zebra and roll them apart, basically. And that's a really violent act, not only on the wildebeest and zebra, but also on the skulls of these guys, because you can bite really hard, and that requires a whole lot of muscles and joints that deal with that kind of force. But if you start twisting this whole thing, that requires a whole lot of other types of adaptations to deal with those forces associated with torsion, right? It's like a big doorknob you're trying to turn in a way. And we're going to kind of parse some of that out as well. So modern archosaurs, birds and crocs, have fairly different skulls. Their skulls work fairly differently from one another. They're related to one another, though, and this makes them a really rich kind of tapestry of evolution to really get into how different animals use the same types of tissues, like bone, muscles, and cartilage, to do quite different things, but with all mostly the same parts. Finally, T-Rex is one of the cool epitomes of evolution. We all love T-Rex. It's a little overplayed, but we know a lot about them. These are really big animals. So, Sue the T-Rex up at the Field Museum, or this is Stan, which is up in South Dakota. These animals have like 6-foot-long skulls. They're 4 feet wide, and they're like 4.5 feet deep this way, or tall. So these things are huge, right? And they have big banana-shaped teeth. And obviously, these things were basically evolved to eat other animals without thinking twice. And we want to know how this works because these guys, these animals, tyrannosaurs, also have some of these same joints in their skull that look like birds. And so when you get into their different skull bones, they have these weird ball and socket joints in there. And when we think ball and socket joints, we think our hips, which can move quite a bit. But it turns out some of the research we've been doing in the lab is finding that just because you have a quote-unquote ball and socket joint doesn't mean it can actually move. It actually ends up being a feature of joints that need to grow, that have cartilage on the ends of them that need to keep growing. And the trick with these animals is that these guys, tyrannosaurs and alligators and crocodilians, seem to grow for a long period of time. So they don't necessarily have indeterminate growth like we used to hear about in the 50s and 60s, like gators will grow forever. They kind of plateau out over time, but it takes them a very long time to get up there. And to keep growing, you have to have cartilage that allows your body to keep growing. We use up all of our cartilage in our bodies by the time we're around 18 or 19 years old, which means we don't get taller, we tend to just get fatter. So T-Rex is really cool. It likes to eat things. We like to figure out how it can actually bite as hard as it does. Our general estimates these days is that this animal bites somewhere around 50 to 60,000 newtons. How many people here know what that means? Does anybody can imagine what 50 to 60,000 newtons means? Yeah, in the back. Probably enough to break your bones. That's right. So we can come up with all sorts of weird analogies, but let's say if T-Rex had you in its jaws, it'd be like trying to bench press a semi-truck. Can any of you bench press a semi-truck? Any power lifters here? CrossFitters? Probably not. All right? So we have this animal that bites harder than anything that we can really imagine. And it does so without failing, so it doesn't break its bones in the process. And this is a really amazing feat of skeletal tissues, like bone and muscles and cartilage. And it's a really amazing feat of evolution. And we've kind of taken this really amazing animal and kind of just turned it into something that eats lawyers. And so, you know, and Jurassic Park came out right when I was graduating high school. And it kind of didn't really inspire me to go into paleo. I kind of came a little later. But people spend their whole dissertations now figuring out if T-Rex could actually shake its head back and forth. All right? Because like with alligators, it takes a certain number of things to be able to do this really well. It takes a different set of things to be able to do that. And with these animals, they actually have necks very similar to birds, all right? And birds kind of move their necks this way, right? You watch chickens walk and they kind of bob. And if you watch a heron try to swallow a fish, sometimes you'll see a little bit of shaking, but really they just kind of choke the fish down this way. Like their bodies are built to work in this kind of fore-aft movement in general. They don't really shake their heads much this way. And so we're actually trying to figure out if this lawyer scene could be legit or not, sorting out how T-Rex heads work. We know they bite really hard, but it's possible they couldn't actually shake their heads very well because the way some of their bones and muscles and joints are built, they might not have been able to actually do that. So Steven Spielberg was wrong. This is all good. So if you come over into the lab, we're all about heads. We really like to figure out how they're built. We like to kind of dig into the muscles and the cartilage and the bones of the ligament. We have students working on joints. We're working on nerves that course through the heads to figure out how sensitive they are. We take all these parts, the Legos, so to speak, and figure out how these all work together. So how do joints and muscles and tendons and ligaments and cartilage all work together to build something that moves and can do things dynamically and bite things and eat lawyers and all you want. But really the big question is how do all these lineages evolve? How do you really get to chase down how you go from some primitive animal like Euparkeria into something that looks like T-Rex or a parrot, all right, or along this other lineage, some group of animals that actually evolves into crocodilians. Where is like where does evolution kind of tinker with these lineages over basically the 230 million years of evolution that we have for this group of animals? And I find that to be really interesting. We see animals along these lineages stiffen their skulls or make their skulls really flexible. And why do they do this? Because once you start stiffening things, it's hard to go back. And if you start making things really flexible, it's also hard to make that stiff again with the time involved. And I find this to be really fascinating. These same questions occur along the lines of development. So when we're embryos, we see similar changes that happen as we go from little embryos to hatchlings and so on. And I find this part to be the most interesting part of the work we do. So if you come over into our lab, one of the main things we do is dissect things. We get animals and we take them apart. And so we get lots of donations from rehab sites. We have various veterinarians and breeders that donate snakes and lizards and things. We work with museums and zoos to work on animals that they try to take care of, all to kind of figure out how things work. This is a 13-foot reticulated python that was donated to us like 2.5 weeks ago. You can see that we need a bigger lab, all right? And we do quite a bit on reptiles, but we also work on mammals, and we have fishes going right now. One of these buckets has a shark head in it. So we teach all of our students how all animals are built, although we tend to focus on reptiles. We chop these things up with either scalpels, but also really fine blades. So we do a lot of histology, meaning we take chunks of tissues and we slice it very thin, all right? And so we can look at then growth plates of cartilage inside the heads of ducks. We can look at how the trigeminal nerve goes out into the chin of an alligator and where it's really sensitive. They have little invisible whiskers. We can kind of chop up T-Rex cartilage, which is here, which we'll talk about later today. And then we can pretty much take a big chunk of an alligator head and embed it in resin, the same stuff you might shellac a boat with, and basically put that through a really heavy blade, and then look at how bone, which is here in red, meets up with muscle, here this other stripy red stuff, then with another joint in its skull that's got cartilage on it, and then also this weird disc thing that's running through it. So we get to see anatomy not only in dissection ways, but also in cross sections. This is really important to understand how animals are built, but it's turning into a really important tool that our students need to learn as they go up into health sciences in particular, where they have to look at CAT scan images of people. All right, and any of you have had to look at your own CAT scan images? It's really hard to figure out where you're at, and it takes a lot of practice to kind of understand the anatomy you're looking at. So we treat animals like loaves of bread. We can take little alligators still in their eggshells, or parts of big alligators like their teeth, and micro CT them or take them into a big medical CT and CAT scan them. And so on some Sunday mornings, we happen to use the hospital micro CT, CAT scanner, the same one they use on us. Sometimes we get bumps, so we'll have this big snake in there, and then we have to get it out where there's some emergency scanning going on. But it's all good. So we really like to see inside animals, sometimes without damaging them. We have this really cool new tool over in geology now that all of campus kind of threw into. It's called Mizzou X. It's this really fancy X-ray microscope. It's kind of like a CAT scanner. It uses X-rays to look at densities of tissues, but it scans really little things at really high resolution. So you can take the tip of your finger and put it in this thing. You won't get your finger back, but you can look at that at ultimately 0.9 micron slice thickness. Do any of you know how small that is? Right? So we've got 60,000 newtons here. We've got 0.9 microns here, right? We're operating on these really crazy scales of size as well. And 0.9 microns is below the size of a cell. Okay, it's like the scale of viruses. And we can zap tissues to look at things at that small scale or something a little bigger, which is where we hang out at. We can take our animals these days and also dunk them in iodine. It turns out that iodine lends contrast to soft tissues. When you usually do a CAT scan, it only shows you your bones really well because your bones are dense. Now we can dunk our animals in iodine. They're already dead. We dunk them in iodine, and the iodine binds to muscles and makes the muscles dense. So then that lights up in CT, and so we can actually start seeing muscle architecture in ways we weren't really able to do it before. And this is really cool. So there's a parrot, and these are the jaw muscles you're seeing kind of poking through here, and a CAT scan. And 10 years ago, we didn't know we could ever be able to do this. And so in the lab here at Mizzou, we've been kind of refining this method quite a bit and putting it to use in a lot of different ways. And so now, not only can we dissect animals, we can chop them up into analog slices using histology, but we can chop them up into digital slices as well and see muscles and nerves and cartilages in ways that we weren't really able to see 10 years ago. This is really cool. We can take all this data and do engineering with it. So we can build, let's see how this works. We can build these things called finite element models, which lets us build a model of a lizard or a T-Rex or a parrot and bend it and break it in different ways to see how strong the bones are or how bones might fail in different behaviors. All right? We can take parts of animals, the actual parts, and put them in a material properties tester where we get to bend and break things like this alligator chin. We did a study a few years ago to figure out how alligator chins work. Their mandibles come out like this, and we're all going to get pro at this today. But when alligators bite things, it's particularly one-sided, so imagine your hands are like an alligator jaw like this, right? And you find a poodle, and the alligator eats the poodle. And so it grabs the poodle's right here. I'm sorry if you like poodles, I don't. Right? It bites it, and these jaws like to roll and bend a little bit out here at the chin. Remember, they have these little chins, but it's cantilevered way out here in this long face. All right? So when you're going to put a big bite force of an alligator out on your tooth, where the poodle is, it's going to try to lever this chin apart. And so alligators have these really cool features that hold their chins together. And we wanted to figure out how that worked. And so this little movie is basically not showing you when this thing breaks. Yeah, whatever, movies, right? So anyway, we basically rig these things up, and we can bend and break actual bones and joints to see when they fail or when they yield. And this is just standard engineering practices that we do on cars and planes and things like that as well. We have a lot of big data issues as we kind of CAT scan all these animals and pull the bones together and figure out all the engineering designs that go into how an animal works. We have to try to explain all this anatomy to people, and those could be other scientists or it could be you. And so we're figuring out ways to kind of project all this complicated anatomy in ways that's more easy to understand. So down here is an alligator model with these big vectors. See these big arrows here? These are basically the jaw muscles. So this big orange arrow here is our pterygoid muscles. They shoot up into the face of our alligator, and they're really important for dealing with torsion. And it's hard to see this in 3D when you're just chopping things up, or even when you're dissecting it. But now we figured out with the help of Kevin Middleton, who's another IA faculty member who's probably sitting in the audience somewhere, we figured out how to take all this anatomical information, project it into a 3D vector like this, which we can put up on the internet pretty well, but then back project it into a triangle plot. And all this shows you guys is that this big orange arrow hangs out down here in this part of the plot, in which it has a really big rostrocaudal orientation, or kind of front-back orientation this way. And then it also has a fairly large kind of really flat dorsoventral, so it's very flat this way as opposed to being vertical this way. And we can just kind of project these different muscles different ways. And just looking at the constellation of dots, you can kind of see that alligators have a lot of different jaw muscles oriented in different ways that help mediate the forces that it deals with when it bites things, okay? This is kind of beyond us today, but we use this quite a bit to try to explain what changes happen in muscles over time. Because we can then make models of an alligator that's opening and closing its mouth. So when the mouth is closed, its jaw muscles are in one orientation, and as it opens, they get stretched out in different directions. And we can then plot this, how these muscles change orientation during biting. So we can kind of track how these muscles are changing dynamically. We can also look at a whole bunch of different sized alligators. We have little baby alligators up here and big adult alligators down below. And we know from alligator skull shape, they start off with very tall skulls. They're very cute. They chirp, okay, just like birds. Well, they have very tall skulls, and their muscles are very vertically oriented. And as they get bigger, the skulls flatten out, and their muscles also flatten out, all right? And this has to do with how alligators feed and do death rolls and things like that. And we can kind of map out how all these muscles change orientation over time. And that time could be just during a feeding cycle. It could be over ontogeny, like how they grow up. And it could be over phylogeny. So we could actually map out these muscles along the line to birds, from like early dinosaurs up through Archaeopteryx and into parrots. And this is some of the stuff some of our students are doing. Finally, one of the coolest things we've gotten into is 3D fiber tracking. So we can take all this iodine data that we're getting and then basically figure out the strands of muscle fascicles in 3D, color code them based on their orientations, again, kind of like the triangle plots, and figure out how muscles differ inside of muscles. So, you know, we have this muscle called a biceps here, all right? And most of the muscles, I don't really have one, hold on. There it is, all right. So most of your biceps fibers run parallel with your humerus, your upper arm bone here. And it's really good for kind of, you know, curling remote controls, all right? On the other hand, your pectoralis muscle, the one up here in your chest that you kind of don't do push-ups very well with, it has fibers in various different directions, okay? And so we can kind of chase this type of anatomy down pretty well with imaging. And this is allowing us to do some really wicked stuff now. So this is a human hand that's been immersed in iodine. And now we're actually looking at kind of the fiber architecture of muscles in your hands. Now we can dissect people pretty well. We know what they look like. But this is giving us new access to numbers and really complicated morphology that we haven't been able to do before. And so with the right types of samples, we can look at how people with carpal tunnel and different types of thenar wasting diseases in our muscles of our hand change with those pathologies or change with age. We had a recent paper published in IOB, Integrative Organismal Biology, that featured one of the first studies using this technique on starling muscles. Starlings are these little birds that you find everywhere. They're very small. They fit in our scanner on campus, and it worked out beautifully. And so we're really going hog wild over this. We actually are working on a group with the Brookfield Zoo up in Chicago. They're one of 5 zoos in the country that are trying to raise pangolins. If you haven't heard of pangolins, they're one of the most endangered animals on the planet right now. They're used for bushmeat and food, but they have all these beautiful scales all over their bodies that are used for Eastern medicine. And so they're being basically pilfered through all of Southeast Asia and Africa for food and other uses. And they've gone from being unknown to the world to being one of the most critically endangered species in the world in about 10 years. And so zoos are now racing to try to figure out how to keep these guys alive. One of the problems with pangolins is that they're anteaters. And so they have these huge long tongues that shoot out of their faces to, you know, pick up ants out of trees and termites and things like that. So this animal, let's just say he's like maybe 4 feet long with the tail. He's like this long with tail. That tongue actually can stretch out to be about twice the length of his body. So let's say it's 2 feet of body, 2 feet of tongue. So 4 feet of tongue is packed in there. So if you have 4 feet of tongue in your body, where do you put it? So pangolins actually curl their tongue up inside their bodies. And so pangolin tongues hang out down here by their kidney, we've learned. And they have this really cool coil that shoots the tongue way out of their body. And then we think, we're testing this, we think the elastic energy stored in this coil of bone then helps pull the tongue back in. And we've got a student kind of working on this now. The zoo people care about this because the adaptations that anteaters have to be able to push this tongue out through their face and then scrape all the termites into their throat makes them have a really narrow throat. And so when they bring these pangolins into the clinic to do normal workups on them, they have to anesthetize them. They're wild animals, they claw. So they knock them out just with a face mask. But if there's an emergency, they have to intubate animals. You know, when they put the breathing tube down your throat. Well, these animals have these really silly anteater faces, and they can't fit tubes down their face. So when these pangolins kind of crash in the clinic, they have a hard time getting them back because they can't intubate them well. So we're helping figuring out the tongue because we want to know what's happening up here in the throat, because we're going to hopefully work with some engineer who can help design a better intubation tube for pangolins. So this is where all this anatomy comes in, is that, yeah, we work on reptiles, we work on humans, and we can kind of figure out all the anatomy of these systems to not only figure out paleontologically how T-Rex might have worked, but also help out with conservation efforts to try to help weirdly shaped heads of other animals around today. So you can go up to the Brookfield Zoo and see one of these guys on display. The rest of them are in a dark, safe place where they're trying to make pangolin babies. Finally, we can take all this kind of digital data and upload it on the internet and try to share it with the general public. We can try to share it with school groups, classrooms. Many of our models that we're working on, we're trying to make printable, so you can 3D print them if you want. So we can make 3D models of muscles. We can make, you know, vectograms of skulls to try to show off kind of quantitative or numerical data. We can basically show off 3D muscle architecture of like the pectoralis muscle of a starling and then all those muscles in there. And then we can also put this in virtual reality or augmented reality, where we can basically put a Google Cardboard on a kid's head and they open their eyes and they're surrounded by crocodile heads, which is pretty cool. And if you're not exhausted by this slide like I am, this is pretty much what the lab's like. We've got like 10 people in the lab and everybody's doing something different, and it's quite exciting. So there's 3D spinny things everywhere around the lab. We take this out on the road. If you come to Dinosaurs and Caveman Science Expo the last 7 years, you might have seen our gang kind of doing things. We do outreach for a number of different groups around town, everything from kindergarten to master naturalist groups and Rotary. So give us a holler if you're looking for some help on educating you on some sort of topic having to do with natural history, evolution, or mechanics. So this is kind of the group that's been doing a lot of outreach around here. It includes folks from Raptor Rehab, Fish and Wildlife, CPS Planetarium's been hosting us for all these years, and it's a really good time. Some might say it's even a hoot. So we'll be back next year. No more puns. And finally, I have to thank all the people in my lab, because coming up on 10 years here, I kind of cry sometimes thinking about all the people who've come through the lab and have not cried. And right now we have about 10 people in the lab. This is most of them. This semester we have 5 people going off to better things. So we have a student going to med school, 2 going to dental school, 1 got a tenure track job at a school in Pennsylvania, 1's going to medical school here. And so all these students that come up through the lab, the undergrads come up and they go off to graduate school, med school, dental school. We train them up on how to see things in 3D, CAT scanning, histology, all the stuff. And we also train up students to do more academic research going forward as well. It's just been really fantastic, and I don't know how many. Who's here from my lab? Anybody? Did anybody come? I saw Alec. Where's Alec? Alec, yeah, Alec sleeps in the lab. He's supposed to go to, have you heard yet? All right, I won't embarrass you. Later. We're waiting to hear from a big school from him. The rest of today, I'm largely going to talk about a tale of 2 joints. Animals have lots of joints in their skulls. They use them differently, and I've kind of primed you all up for where we're going. So we use joints for loading and movement, so I'm using joints to kind of move around, but my joints right now and my knees are also holding up this really hefty body weight that I carry around. So it's not just for movement, but it's also for forces and loads. Our joints are really important for development and growth. If your joints don't work right, your limbs or your skulls don't grow right, and they don't work right. So joints are really important for growth, if not probably more so than loading and movement in some ways. And they're made up of bone as well as lots of different types of soft tissues, okay? And not all bone is the same. There's stiff bone and flexible bone, so you know. And soft tissues, ligaments, tendons, cartilages. There's like all sorts of different types of cartilages out there. And there are muscles that then cross over these joints, and muscles come in lots of different shapes and things. So tyrannosaurs, these things bite hard, right? They have these really tall skulls that are seemingly flexible. They have these weird ball and socket joints in there that some paleontologists want them to be really wiggly, and they want T-Rex to be able to expand its head open like a snake and swallow Triceratops somehow. I don't think that's the case, and I'm going to tell you why. And so it's kind of a functional paradox. So why do you have an animal that's evolved, for a long time to bite really, really hard, but then all of a sudden have leaky joints? Like if you want to bite hard, you don't want a lot of those forces to leak away from the paleopoodle T-Rex might have been eating, okay? Crocodilians, they also bite really hard, all right? But instead, they have what we call a heavily sutured akinetic skull, meaning they really only have one joint, although I'm lying to you because I'm going to tell you about a second joint. They only have these two joints in the back, the main jaw joints, but all the rest of their bones in their skull are largely sutured or locked together. All right, they don't have any of these weird ball and socket joints that birds and tyrannosaurs have. But what I will tell you about is they do have the second jaw joint called the pterygomandibular joint, or PMJ, and I'll tell you all about it. There's our otic joint. I'm going to spend some time talking about this one ball and socket joint up here in a T-Rex, and then I'm going to spend some time here talking about the PMJ, or the pterygomandibular joint, in alligators. So our big question right now is, did T-Rex have a flexible skull? Again, for the past 100 years, basically in our field, a lot of folks have felt that because T-Rex has these weird ball and socket joints, that it must have a flexible head. And again, it's a weird functional paradox, because why do you want to have a flexible skull if you also want to bite really, really hard? Tyrannosaurs weren't always big. They actually evolved from a stock of little predatory dinosaurs that are kind of similar to velociraptors, but more primitive. And it wasn't really until their last 30 years of their evolution, probably about 100 million years ago to 65 million years, that they really started taking off in size. And we know a lot about T-Rex because we have about 30 specimens of them now. They're really big, so you find them really easily, all right? So our lens of the fossil record is largely based on large animals because it's easy to find the trunk of a tree than it is to find a twig of a tree, right? So if you have big animals that are as big as trees, it's really easy to find them, as opposed to little birds and little mammals that are more like the twigs. And we know less about them because they don't preserve as well. So we know a lot about T-Rex. They're these big, kind of tall skulls with really robust faces. They're kind of built like hyenas are. But they weren't always like that. Some of them had really long faces, and that's kind of what this guy is. We have some questions about it, though. This is an animal called Alligator. It's actually from Asia. It's like Asian T-Rex in a way. And this is one of the few skulls of this guy we have. Notice how it's got a really long, slender face. A very long, slender face. And it's got not big banana-shaped teeth, but kind of little pokey teeth. And one of the big problems we have in paleontology is we don't get a lot of fossils. And some of them are poached. This one actually came from a poached specimen. And it's found in the same rocks as kind of Asian T-Rex, which has a really short hyena-like face. But this guy's a long face. And our question is this its own taxon, or is it actually a juvenile T-Rex? Because we have some data out there that suggests that juvenile tyrannosaurs didn't get the big, robust hyena heads until they were older, where in fact maybe their teenager T-Rexes and younger T-Rexes had these long faces. And so this guy, we don't actually know whether it's an Alligator, like its own taxon, or it's baby T-Rex. We have this problem, because this thing works differently head-wise, right? It's got a really long face. It probably didn't bite as hard. It's also obviously smaller, all right? But did this actually grow up into T-Rex, or is this its own group of tyrannosaurs living alongside the other guys? We have these questions. So T-Rex has all these parts to it. It's got big, robust joints in its skull. It's got really big jaw muscles. And the bones of the roof of the mouth kind of come together in the midline to help reinforce the face. And these are features that we tend to consider associated with hard biting. So this is an alligator, and this is all the secondary palate here just like us. And in fact, this guy named Mark Ferguson spent most of the 80s using alligators as a model for cleft palate in us, because our palates come together in the midline the same way the palates of alligators come together while they're embryos. And so we're actually using alligators as a model for our pathologies for quite some time. They're quite interesting. So T-Rex kind of has a palate that's kind of like this one, kind of like ours, and this suggests that it had a fairly stiff skull. However, it's got these ball and socket joints up here at what we call the otic joint, and down at the rack, called the palatal basal joint. And there's some muscles in there. They might be more ligamentous than muscular. We can look at these joints. Whenever we look at the bones of a fossil, we try to look at the same structures in their extant relatives. So if we want to look at dinosaurs, we look at modern birds, and we look at their other relatives, crocodilians, and we also look at lizards and turtles, other kind of more distant relatives. So when we want to look at the otic joint of a T-Rex, the first thing we really do is look at birds and alligators. So this is a ball and socket joint. This is called the otic joint of a duck. This is the same thing that's moving around quite a bit when they feed. And you can see it's got cartilage on one side as well as the other. So this beautiful cartilage here on that side, here on that side. And there's actually a synovial cavity in here that lubricates it and allows it to wiggle quite a bit in a duck. This is the same joint in an alligator. It only has cartilage on one side of the joint, the quadrate side, and then it's only got this kind of fibrous ligamenty stuff on the other side. And there's no way this thing moves. It's all sutured around it, but it still maintains its growth plate in the quadrate. So these two animals, despite them being completely separate evolutionarily 200 million years ago, and doing very different things with their skulls, still maintain a quadrate bone that has cartilage on it because it serves as a growth plate, but then it gets locked up for akinesis, not being able to move, or maybe allowing it to move, all right, like ducks. We have a number of birds that also have cartilage on both sides of the joint, but they don't move, so we have a problem. Anyway, so we had this question, though. Let me go back. Birds actually ended up being able to grow this cartilage on this bone up here. This is squamosal. This is the same bone up here on the side of your skull. Most animals cannot grow cartilage on certain bones of our skull that derive through membranous ossification, and I'm not going to talk about it. For the most part, we can grow cartilage on the ends of bones that develop like our limb bones. That includes the quadrate bone in particular. So it's got this big old growth plate coming off the bone here. You see all these little chondrocytes all stacked up, all ready to grow and get longer so the alligator gets bigger. All right, and ducks can do this too. But ducks are different because they can also grow cartilage on these membrane bones. This is a really cool adaptation. This showed up at some point during avian evolution where it didn't show up in croc evolution. Lizards can't do it, turtles can't do it. Fossil mammals can't do it either, but modern mammals like us can do it, and we have secondary cartilage, or this special cartilage on a couple parts of our jaws. So our big problem is, well, so if you have these two animals, these are the same joints, but they're built with different tissues, and birds were able to build this joint with this new type of tissue and allow it to do something new, wiggle, so to speak. So when we look at a T-Rex, it also has this kind of ball and socket joint, but we want to know, when did this cartilage arise? Did T-Rex have this special secondary cartilage on it or not? Does this have anything to do with how the joint works? So we went and looked at a bunch of tyrannosaurs. So we went up to the Museum of the Rockies, which has a whole lot of tyrannosaurs. This is where Jack Horner was for about 30 years. You go up to Montana, and apparently you just kind of trip over T-Rexes. So they have baby T-Rexes, they got adult T-Rexes, they got everything in between. Goldilocks T-Rexes, they're all there. But one in particular is really interesting to us because it was found disarticulated. So a lot of these skulls are found together, all the bones are together and they're kind of smashed up. But this one called B-Rex, all the bones were found disarticulated, which means we could actually see inside of the joints. And we started looking inside of the joints, and here's our otic joint of our squamosal. We saw this cool, we didn't see like some smooth surface of the joint, which would suggest that maybe there was just fibrous tissue there. Instead, we found this cool plaque of stuff right in the joint. And if we have this kind of hypothesis that says, all right, if the bone of the joint is smooth, then we might infer that it's fibrous. If the surface of the joint might be rough, perhaps there's cartilage there. And that then suggests that T-Rex and other dinosaurs had the ability to grow secondary cartilage in this joint that birds then inherited it from. All right, so the stuff that we see in birds isn't a bird thing, but it's actually a dinosaur thing. So we looked at this joint and said, wow, look, it's got this schmutz on it. We need to figure out what this stuff is. And so we got these specimens on loan. We came over here to the hospital and CAT scanned them. I ended up in the ER for something in October, and this guy, Eric, He was the guy who actually scanned me when I was in the hospital. It was awesome. He's like, wait, that's the guy we did the T-Rex bones with. So we have lots of jokes. So we CAT scan these things. We give them lots of hugs while they're here for good luck. And this lets us look inside of these bones. So this is the quadrate of a T-Rex. And this bone's about this big. This kind of big flat part you see here is about the size of my two hands together. I brought a little version of it. This is a 3D printed smaller version of a T-Rex quadrate. So in real life, this bone would have been twice the size this way, all right? This is the quadrate bone. This is the same bone that we have in our ear called the incus. You guys know you guys have 3 little bones inside of your ear that lets you hear me right now? This is one of those bones, except in T-Rex, it's like this big. Whereas in you can barely see it on your fingernail. All right, this is cool stuff. So this lets us kind of archive the whole bone. So if we accidentally break it, the museum could print out a fake one. But it also allows us to kind of start looking at different types of the bone here inside of the element. What we discovered was that, we still have the schmutz inside of the joint, but we needed to see it better. So then we took the fossils down to Texas where they have a really fancy CAT scanner that lets us see it in really high resolution. And so this is my postdoc Alita at the time, and Matt Colbert, who's a tech down there, scanning a T-Rex quadrant. You can see how big this thing is relative to these two people. All right? It's like the size of Alita's thorax almost. This allows us to start seeing inside a bone really well. And so this is that ball and socket joint now. This is the quadrate bone up here. This is the squamosal. And here you can kind of see that ball and socket shape. Okay? You guys can probably agree with that. You can see there's trabeculae in here. What we still couldn't see, even at this resolution, was there any cartilage still in there or mineralized cartilage or anything like that. So all this digital data that we acquired helped support our hypothesis that we might be seeing this stuff that's cartilage, but we then need to now section it at an even higher or finer resolution. So we got all these data here. We haven't damaged the fossil at all yet, as far as we know. But this gave us some evidence to then go to the curator up at the MOR and say, through all this scanning, we now have a pretty good idea that what we're looking at is probably this cartilage, but we need to see it even better. And we kind of made this mini proposal with all these data in it, with the hypothesis testing and all the rubric that goes into it. And Jack Horner said, okay, go ahead, you can cut it up. So we got this B-Rex fossil, and I got to take a Dremel with a little diamond blade to a T-Rex fossil and cut out these little wedges of bone that we thought had a little bit of mineralized cartilage in it. I did an okay job. Took it out. We then CAT scanned that at 5 microns. All right, so now we're at like histological grade CAT scanning where we can see cells. And in that data, we saw all this kind of schmutz, this little gray stuff where the red arrows are. And if you really look closely, which you can't see in here, there are little holes, these little round circular holes in there. And that's a pretty good sign that we're actually seeing some remnants of cartilage in there. So the CAT scan data was okay. Remember, we're actually CAT scanning a 67 million-year-old piece of rock, all right? And we're able to see biological organization in this. If you look, you can probably see these lines, these little rings in these data. These are growth rings inside of the bone. And this is what our bones look like too. So then we took the actual fossil and cut it up with histology. And so we knew that we wanted to really zoom in on this region of some of these specimens. And when we actually put it underneath the microscope, we saw this. And these are stacks of chondrocytes or cartilage cells within a bony matrix that's been fossilized 67 million years ago. And this now gives us pretty good evidence that we have identified and found cartilage on the surface of this joint in a T-Rex odic joint that's similar to what we see in birds. That's pretty cool. So this means that now we know the T-Rex odic joint has 2 layers of cartilage. It's got cartilage on the quadrate side, which was expected, and we tested this, and it's legit. But it also has cartilage on this side of the joint, just like in ducks, just like in some other birds. Right now, we're trying to figure out if it was or wasn't synovial. Because it turns out we started sampling more birds while we were doing this. And this is our duck. It's got cartilage, space for synovial fluid, and then cartilage again. But then we're also looking at emus, like those big, flightless ostrich-looking things that we use for oil and farming around here sometimes. Emus, it turns out, have cartilage on both sides of the joint, but then they link the whole thing together with fibrous tissue. And this sucks because we can tell you that there's cartilage on both sides of this joint, but we can't tell you what's in between these things in a 65 million year old fossil. So we're coming up with some other lines of evidence to test these different hypotheses now as to whether we know the joint had cartilage on both sides, just like a bird. So this means that birds inherited this secondary cartilage from their dinosaur ancestors. But we're having a hard time debating figuring out if it's synovial, which would mean it could be quite wiggly, or if it was kind of fibrous and fixed. So we're kind of sorting this out right now. But the cool thing is, like, we can go back and find cartilage in fossils. All right, so 20 years ago, we didn't think that you could go look at a 65 million year old thing, or a 200 million year old fossil, or even 400 million year old fossil, and find cartilage in it. And now with a lot of the new technology people are designing using kind of laser spectroscopy and elemental analysis and micro CT scanning, we can now identify what you might call soft tissues in the hard rock record. Okay? We can get at this and now actually get at interesting biological questions. Did dinosaurs grow the same cartilage birds did? All right? This probably helped with growth, and that's cool. And we're still kind of figuring out if this joint was flexible or not. I really don't think it is. We have some other data that suggests it's not. We went into Salt Lake City at the Utah Museum there, where they have drawers and drawers of Allosaurus. And the first bones we looked at, they have the same schmutz on them. So we now kind of have a good idea that going farther back in time, Allosaurus is from around 140 million years ago. Allosaurus also had secondary cartilage in it. Okay? So dinosaurs have been able to grow cartilage on membrane bones of their skull for quite some time. All right? And this is really cool. So stay tuned. Maybe in 5 years, I'll come back and tell you more about this story. But the important thing is that we can go back. We have these interesting questions about how modern day skulls are built and how they work. And we want to figure out where they come from. Okay? And we can kind of get at this with good scientific methodology, sampling of tissues, technology, and good old-fashioned kind of science. Right? And we were able to find soft tissues in a rock record, which is really cool. The second set of joints that I'm going to talk about, oh, my clock is not working. All right, I know, I'm cool. All right, so the second joint we're going to talk about is the pterygomandibular joint. And like we kind of talked about, alligators are really cool because they can eat poodles, which I despise. And, but they bite really hard, and they grow for a really long time. The oldest alligators we have on record are about 100 years old. If you go to the north side of Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia, there's a park on the north side, and there's this big old alligator there called Oscar. And they know Oscar was over 100 years old because the Okefenokee Swamp Forestry Service kept a journal, a log, and Oscar hung out at the park for 100 years that the park had been open. And one day, finally, Oscar succumbed to something, and they skeletonized him, and they have him all set up. He's on display there, and he's this big old alligator. There's a glass case, like over here by his skeleton, that's got a poodle collar in it, with a little collar, and it's got a little name that said like Puddles or something on it. Peaches is Peaches. So Oscar ate Peaches, whoever Peaches was at some point. I think Peaches was a poodle. So crocodiles bite really hard, and we know when they bite, they go this way. They have these sets of jaw joints in the back that allow their jaws to go up and down. I think I can do this. It goes like that. All right, so there's your alligator skull, and it moves up and down like this. All right, this whole space back in here is all filled with jaw muscles, all right, for the force of this bite. All right, so it can bite up and down really well. But the really interesting thing is this big flange. So you guys see this big flange that comes down off the side of the skull? This is called the pterygoid buttress. And you know, we're not the first ones to see this thing, right? It's right there. But in the literature, all the croc biologists would always say, well, you know, the pterygoid buttress is kind of cool. It slides along the mandible. It has a casual articulation with it, like, you know, they're kind of friends, you know. But in the literature, like, nobody really kind of took a hard look at how this thing works. And we were started doing some mechanics of crocodile skulls the last few years. And as we'd build models and look at how they bit things, the equations basically weren't working out, in that parts of the skull would always fail, and it wasn't until you started including aspects of these big flanges in the system where the alligator skull wouldn't fail. And so we really got excited by this because, again, you look at an alligator skull, it's like, there's this thing there. We know it's there. So it's not like we discovered this thing, but we actually discovered kind of the methodology and questions to properly ask. What's up with this thing that we're calling the PMJ, or the pterygomandibular joint? So this buttress forms, basically our running hypothesis is that it forms a second craniomandibular articulation, or basically a second jaw joint. So we have the primary one back here between the quadrate and articular bones. And then this thing basically has a surface that, again, I shouldn't have done that. Almost regardless of how open the jaw is, it maintains a surface that contacts the mandibles a little bit throughout gape. All right, so alligators can probably open their mouths about that far, all right, and that it kind of, moves away from the mandible there. But for when they're really biting, they like to bite with their mouths pretty closed, with their turtles and poodles back here by their molars. And that's really close to this joint. And so mechanically, that becomes very important for how alligator heads work. So what I'm going to kind of roll through here kind of quickly is that we've found basically evidence that we have a system of a muscle that comes down and has a disc that rides over this joint. And then the muscle then continues up into the mandible. And again, in 5 years, I'm going to tell you how this muscle acts like a muscle in an insect leg. You got to know your bugs too. And so this joint strengthens the feeding apparatus, and we'll talk about this. We can chase this thing down through the rock record, or the fossil record of Crocs. And it has a lot of the same features as our TMJ articular disc. And many of you may or may not know, but we have this little disc inside of our jaw joint, all right? And it turns out it's remarkably similar to the same disc thing that alligators have. And so I'm going to spill into talking about our jaw joints at the end of this. And so one of the big arguments we're kind of making these days is that the PMJ is probably one of the key features of croc evolution, and it's one of the main features of their skulls that allows them to actually bite really hard. So this other joint is super good for opening and closing your mouths and things. But this other thing, the PMJ, really helps stabilize the entire croc skull to really dish out really high forces. And again, with crocodiles, they're really weird because they have really flat heads. And so T-Rex is a good biter because it has a really tall head. Hyenas have really tall heads, and they also bite really hard because most of those muscles, they contract, and the forces are largely lined up with that vertical plane. All right? So you want all your forces from vertical to go vertically right into your animals. But alligators have really flat heads, so their muscles are actually oriented out horizontally. So how do you almost transform all that horizontal force into ultimately a vertical force? And some of these features help them do that. Okay? It's like a transmission system in a way. So the first thing we do is we always dissect our animals. We cut them open. And so when you actually open up a croc mouth, you can peek down into where this joint is, and they have a little joint cavity. And it turns out, and we had no idea we'd find this. And so we opened up some mouths of alligators, and you can kind of dig into the side of their cheek in here. And their oral cavity, so the space that my finger is in here, actually goes into a little sac, a blind sac that serves as a joint capsule inside, in between the mandible and the skull side of the joints. It's like a hamster pouch. You know, hamsters and gerbils can pack seeds into their faces. That's because they have these blind sacs in their cheeks that they shove all the food in. That's what alligators are doing here also, except they're using that cheek, the pouch, for a joint. And that's really cool. The buttress itself is covered with this fibrous tissue. All the old school folks just saw white and always called it cartilage. We actually put it through a microtome, and it's not cartilage. It's just fibrous tissue. This matters for looking at our jaw joints. We can run it through a microtome or a big saw. In this case, this is an adult alligator embedded in a block of resin like this big that we then put in through a rock saw to then show that here's our buttress here, the cranial, the skull side, so to speak, has muscles that attach to a disc, and the muscles continue on into the mandible. And then here's the mandible itself, just this kind of rind out here. And so you can kind of see how you have bone, disc, bone forming this joint, okay? That's really cool. These are some zoom-ins that don't really matter unless you're really into connective tissue histology. But ultimately, these tissues, they sculpt the bone in certain ways. They grow together. And so some of you up front might see how the buttress here is covered with this kind of spongy texture, all right? And the spongy texture is left over by all these little fibroblasts that grow this fibrous tissue that covers the bone. And this means that this spongy tissue acts as what we call an osteological correlate or a bony signature. we can go through the fossil record, and if we look at this element in a fossil, and it's got this spongy texture to it, that suggests that it has the same tissue capping it, okay? The same way we're looking at the schmutz and the otic joint of T-Rex. So we were able to kind of chase some of this stuff down and find that the disc has very particular properties to it, that it grows during development and turns into this kind of cool fibrous disc thing. It acts like a sesamoid. So our patella in our knee is a sesamoid. It basically helps increase the mechanical advantage of our muscles as they wrap around a joint. So this disc, the cartilagotransilians, helps increase mechanical advantage of basically kind of horizontal muscles. It redirects their forces vertically as they come down into the mandible. So this is one of the tricks that alligators employ to take those horizontally oriented muscles and then turn them into vertical forces by means of a patella, basically, inside of their heads. That's cool. Right. The other really cool thing we figured out is that we can look at where all the muscles are, and we know that alligator jaw muscles, most of them are fairly horizontally oriented, and that's really interesting. We can map this out in 3D like we've talked about. But when we take this into engineering programs, like I kind of mentioned, if we take the mandible, this is the mandible of an alligator, that we put a whole bunch of muscle loads on it, so we built it back up with the same material properties as real alligator bone. It's got a little flexibility in it. It's got sutures built into it, the little plates of ligament that hold different bones together. And we found that if we made these virtual alligator jaws bite, they would fail unless we put a big constraint right here where that pterygoid buttress happens to articulate with the jaw. And this was a big deal because we were running this model without the buttress there, and it just wasn't working. We couldn't figure it out. When we actually decided to look at the other side of the equation, or the skull part, there's that big buttress right there where the laser pointer is, and it fits right under the mandible there. And when we put that constraint, or the buttress, into the equation, the mandible works, okay? So this made us think that, oh, this thing's a lot more important than we've been giving it credit for. Excuse me. So I had the student, Caleb Sellers, who's here. He's been here for a long time. He's been building these really complicated three-dimensional lever models of how skulls work. And he does this all through automated scripting techniques these days with Python and R and MATLAB. And we didn't really have the computational power to do this 15 years ago. We didn't have the computer power. But these days, we can build these really complicated 3D models. We can look at how forces percolate through the jaw joint, which is pretty standard. But we can also look at how these forces are transmitted through the PMJ. And this is some of the new stuff that we've been doing. And when we actually look at how the forces, so you put your poodle somewhere over here where the teeth are, all right? And the poodle forces go back through the skull and have to then transmit through these joints to kind of, equilibrate the skull. When we look at all these forces, we actually found that during alligator development, so these bar graphs, we have a little baby alligator here that's got a fairly vertical head. And then as they get bigger, they become flatter. As alligator heads get flatter and flatter, the pterygomandibular joint, the buttress and its articulation of the mandible, end up actually dealing with more forces than the jaw joint does itself. So this means that, like the gator chomp, in which you kind of think that, as you bite your prey item here, the standard thinking, this works with mammals, is that most of those equilibrium forces, you have bite force here, the other forces end up in the jaw joint. But it turns out that crocodilians pipe most of that force actually through their pterygoid buttress instead of just their jaw joint. And so biomechanically, this means that the PMJ might be the primary jaw joint relative to the regular jaw joint. But also, in some other tests that we did, basically, when alligators bite orthally this way, you have that disc that helps transform some of the horizontal forces into vertical ones. And the joint kind of helps stabilize the mandibles from twisting a little bit. But when you make this alligator model or a real alligator twist or death roll or shake, these pterygoid buttresses become hugely important for how the skull works. Because if you're going to shake your head or twist it, you need this big flange there to help basically stabilize the mandibles from twisting apart and shattering. So when this alligator wants to bite something, and it twists, you need this big articular surface to keep this mandible from twisting and shattering and splintering apart, okay? So without the joint, without this PMJ, alligators could bite things really hard, but it couldn't really wrestle them. It couldn't tear legs off of deers and antelopes and wildebeest, all right? And it probably couldn't bite as hard, all right? But instead, we have a dual joint system now. We have one that allows them to open and close their mouths really well, and then another one that really lets them transform all those muscle forces, all right, into bite force, as well as lets them shake and twist and things. And so that means that this joint's pretty important biomechanically for them. It's really cool. So again, this PMJ is not an open joint like it's been called. It's got a disc and all this kind of stuff in it. It's not a casual articulation. It's actually a legitimate second jaw joint. And people have said it just kind of guides the mandibles, but all the mechanics that we've been doing suggest that it's actually a really good stabilizer, if not probably the most important feature of a modern crocodile skull. And this is all really interesting. So they have kind of this dual craniomandibular joint system. They have two joints in their skulls. And that's neat. The cool thing is that we have a really good fossil record of crocodiles also. And so we can go back in the fossil record and look to see how this thing changes over time across the lineage that leads to modern crocodilians. And so many of you probably aren't familiar with a lot of these animals. They're not dinosaurs. But these guys all in here are from kind of petrified forest in Arizona land. They're from the Triassic. They're about 200 million years old. And we see this great, you might say, progression of crocodilians. These really primitive guys from South Africa and Argentina here. And this is a phytosaur, which is also from petrified forest. And we kind of see this grade of crocodilians evolving. Ultimately, we start seeing these really big predatory guys show up around 190 million years ago that look a lot like tyrannosaurs in a superficial way, although they're very unrelated to them. And then we get these really neat small-bodied guys like Jungersuchus, which is from China, and Protosuchus, which is from also Arizona, from about 170 million-year-old rocks. And we start seeing these guys really start picking up the key features of modern crocs. So if we look at Euparkeria and Rheosuchus, they have this really small ligamentous pterygoid flange here. It's not a big flat buttress. It's kind of dinky. Other parts of their skulls suggest that they couldn't really bite hard. I mean, they did eat other animals, but they weren't necessarily as good at it as modern crocs. They had unfused chins. They have flexible skulls, meaning they have the same ball and socket joints that are a problem in tyrannosaurs. And their jaw muscles are largely vertical. If we start looking at more and more crocs, these are all the same animals here, just a little bigger, we start seeing this really big pterygoid flange show up in this animal called Gracilosuchus, which is an Argentinian animal as well. Reveltosaurus is from petrified forest in Arizona. And this Prestosuchus, a big Brazilian predatory crocodile thing that's like got a skull like this big. These guys start getting really big flanges. These flanges don't have that porous, flat surface that we see in modern crocs yet. But they're starting to assemble the parts that go into a modern crocodile skull. And so the flange becomes really big. Somewhere right around this part of the tree, we start seeing these cool jowl muscles that wrap around. Alligators have these big jowls. You've probably seen them in pictures. Some of their pterygoid muscles get so big, so to speak, that they pooch out of the side of their face and come around the side of their jaw. We've also found out in the lab that these muscles are incredibly important for keeping the mandibles from twisting too far. So not only do these big pterygoid muscles that wrap out laterally help with bite force, but they really help the mandibles because these gator jaws are super long and spindly. They really keep them from twisting apart. So as the alligator jaw likes to twist, the muscles help pull them back into place. So we have evidence for these laterally wrapping pterygoid muscles that really help stabilize the mandibles, which suggests they're starting to tinker with really, really high bite forces. So we start looking at modern crocs, so to speak. These are all kind of Cretaceous crocodiles. I gave a Saturday Morning Science like 6 years ago that talked about these dudes. But these are all different crocodiles that didn't eat animals. So some of these guys ate plants. This is Semasuchus from Madagascar that ate plants. Moreliosuchus from Brazil ate plants. They lived on land. All these things started tinkering with different types of dietary niches, but only after the buttress was in place. So we actually found buttresses in Protosuchus. These are some little primitive crocodile things with heads about as long as your thumb. But they have these really big pterygoid buttresses. Some of them have really weird teeth. We're trying to figure out if they might have eaten plants or not. And then we start seeing bigger and bigger buttresses as we move our way down into modern crocodiles. And so we're starting to argue that this buttress, the PMJ, is one of the key features of croc evolution. Once this thing was in place, crocs started to be able to bite hard, but they also started to tinker with different types of niches, eating plants, living on land, all sorts of things. So this seems like to be a really key feature of croc evolution. All right. As we were working on this, being a human anatomist also, as we started looking at the histology of the joint, as we started looking at the mechanics of how the joint works, it really started becoming strikingly similar to what we see in our TMJs. And so this is a human jaw joint. This is the cranium side of it up here. This is the mandible side of it down here. And this is the disc. And so the mandible side has this cartilage on it, kind of like these other joints we've been talking about. The upper part of the joint has the same fibroblasts or same fibrous tissue that we see in the crocodilian PMJ. And then we have this fibrous disc in between. This is markedly like the PMJ in alligators. So this got me really thinking as to, wow, so if we now know where the PMJ disc and how that joint came to be and what it means biomechanically, might we be able to start figuring out where our disc comes from? We have disc problems. We have all sorts of oral surgeons and dentists that try to figure out how to fix people with joint pain up here and chewing problems and malocclusion, and we spend $1 billion a year treating problems with our jaw joints. And it looks a lot like an alligator joint. So who am I to say I can't get into human biology? So it turns out they have markedly similar features. And so this is kind of taking us into some of the next projects we're doing. This is, again, our human jaw joint. There are some muscles. There's a disc that goes in between the joint here. And it turns out that we have these little ligaments that extend from the joint up into our little ear bones. Now, many of you might know that the earliest ancestors of mammals had the same types of joints as reptiles did. They have a jaw joint made out of the quadrate and articular bones. But during mammalian evolution, our skulls got really tiny. We turned into these little mouse-looking things, shrews. And those bones migrated into our ears, and we grew a new jaw joint, the one that we use today. And the old bones are now the little ossicles in our ears. But our running hypothesis right now is that during that transition where the reptilian jaw joint bones migrated into the ear to turn into the modern mammalian ear, it dragged with it the jaw muscles. Because muscles don't like to change their attachments, even over evolution. And so our running hypothesis right now is that during mammalian ear evolution, as these reptilian bones migrated into the ear, they carried pterygoides with it. And that's maybe where the disc comes from. So what we're thinking, and I'm going to tease this out in about one more slide, is we have a disc here because during development and evolution, millions of years in between, part of the pterygoides muscle pretty much got pinched between the skull and our jaw joint condyle. And when muscles get pinched, they form fibrous tissue, like patellae and sesamoids and things like that. The same way, when our muscles in alligators get pinched in our PMJ, they form a disc. We're thinking that during mammalian evolution and the origin of our ears, pterygoides also got pinched, and that's where a disc comes from. So there are different remnants of our development in here that I'm not really going to get into, but we know that the cartilage side of the equation persists in our heads as these weird ligaments that string our dentary bone to our ear, and these attach to the malleus, which is right against your eardrum, the little bone up there. And then we're hypothesizing that pterygoides is also a continuous band of tissue that runs from our skull here and helps move our mandibles. It forms part of the disc, and then it again extends into our ear. And now all of us in here, have a little tunnel that communicates between our jaw joint and our middle ear. And it allows the passage of these ridiculously little ligaments, okay? But these ligaments seem to be a problem because if you have an ear infection, it seems to cause joint problems, and vice versa. People who have joint problems tend to have a lot of ear pain. And one of the running hypotheses in the medical literature is it's because of these connections, these little ligaments. So if you yank on one thing, the other side of the system is going to get yanked around. So we're digging into this right now to figure out what's up. If this stuff looks a lot like the kind of disc system that we're seeing in alligators, we can do some really cool PowerPoint animations to try to suggest that. And this is the neat thing about kind of what we call paleontology, is that it's not just all about bones. It's about what bones mean for the animals, but then all the other soft tissues that help make the organism. Because the organism didn't care just about bones either. It cared about the muscles and the cartilage and the ligaments. So I'm working with well, let me see. We have one student right now who's starting to dig into this. So this is Kayla Frazier. She just got accepted into USC Dental School. I do not think her parents actually bribed people there. But so coming full circle now, we have access to the Gift of Body service here on campus. So people donate their bodies for education and research. We train up our medical students, nursing students, residents on how we're built based off of your donations. We use this to learn about how we're built, how we work, and how to treat people, but we're also using this to try to figure out where we come from. And so we can take portions of people, dunk them in iodine, micro-CT them at levels that we've never seen before, and start seeing some of these really cool things. So this is the mandibular condyle. So this is the jaw joint in general. This is mandibular condyle. This is the articular disc here, this kind of gray thing. These are all muscles. And then we can actually see these dinky little ligaments here, the thing called the DML and the AML, passing up through this tiny little tunnel into our little ear ossicles. And this is, again, happening in just this little centimeter in our head, all right? And we can see it the size of the screen. And so we can have a student, Kayla, who's never looked inside of a human before in this way, who's never looked at soft tissues or anatomy in this way, and we can train her up to see these and make a 3D model of muscles, ligaments, discs, bones, eardrums, little ear ossicles, to really chase down these really tiny little structures that have really important clinical relevance to us, but also hold really important clues to the evolution of our ears and jaw joints. So she's off to USC here. This is important because we want to know where all these muscles come from. We have an idea of where our ossicles come from. This is our famous Virginia possum. Isn't it cute? They're adorable. You know, their smell, but they have these cool ears. They have really big ear ossicles compared to us. And we have pretty good evidence that they have this system where we have pterygoideus muscle going all the way back into their ear ossicles, but they don't have the tiny little tunnel. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. This is the duck-billed platypus. These guys are also adorable. They have really interesting ears too. They're really weird. But we're getting together with a guy named Zeshi Low up at University of Chicago, who is the top paleontologist who studies the origin of mammalian ears. So we're getting together a grant that's going to look at basically how the jaw joints, ear ossicles, and then these muscles and ligaments that we think we can now figure out through biomechanics, histology, imaging, and things like that. We're going to start chasing down where the TMJ articular disc might have come from by looking at these old cool fossils of little shrew-like things from the Mesozoic like Yanaconodon and Morganucodon, which is almost a late Triassic little mammal with, it's got a head the size of a paperclip, all right? But with imaging, we can see little things now up close, and it's really cool. And again, all these animals are built, we're all built to the same tissues. We all share some evolutionary lineage, which allows us to look at other related animals and test hypotheses, whether they're about physiology or biomechanics or even what tissue it is. This kind of makes what's going on here at Mizzou really interesting, and I think gives all of our students a really cool experience trying to figure out what makes animals work, whether it's about people or other animals. So I think to kind of wrap up, I hope I've kind of showed you how we get at all these different questions with all this kind of slew of approaches. We have this really cool project where it looks like PMJs might reflect on TMJs. We did not name PMJ accidentally, so it didn't rhyme with TMJ. But again, alligators and us, we are very different, but we have a lot of similarities because we all use the same tissues. We all have to operate under the same rules of physics, and this helps drive evolution and how skulls work. So if you come over to the lab, we're kind of considered an evolutionary biomechanics group, and you're welcome to come check us out. All the new imaging techniques are just absolutely fantastic in allowing us to see things, both very small and very old. The computational and engineering approaches we're able to do now with computer systems is allowing us to do really high-end computational studies of how engineering and bones work and all the complex math that goes into it. But really, I think we're trying to train up a whole lot of people here that are able to have a holistic approach to animals and plants, both by looking at things, dissection, histology, also by then testing them using engineering approaches, physiological approaches, but then also kind of moving all this into the realm of the virtual world and sharing it better with virtual reality, uploading 3D printable models online, and that really helps our science get out to the public and people like you more easily. And so with that, I'd like to just thank particularly the National Science Foundation, University of Missouri, for really letting this all happen, as well as museums from around the world. So with that, I think I have time for questions, and thanks for coming.
Alrighty, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and I'll bring you a microphone.
Hi.
Hi, fascinating lecture. I have a few questions. Let me just start by saying you've talked about the vertical jaw movements and the torsion, but you haven't talked about chewing. I assume none of these animals chew. Is that a whole separate system? And also, what's the evolutionary advantage of the flat heads of the crocodile?
Yeah, all right, 2 questions to tease out. Chewing is a really loaded word. We usually say chewing. We describe, I think the definition of chewing for us is that we actually use a transverse power stroke. So, you know, we bite like this a little bit, but the big part of the chew comes in pulling the mandible across the food, kind of this rotary action this way. And the mammalian folks like to use that to define chewing. But we have lizards that have specialized teeth and also have pretty complicated jaw movements that people have argued to be chewing. And some of our fossil crocodiles have, instead of this kind of hinge-like jaw joint, they have a mortar and pestle jaw joint, and also weirdly shaped teeth with wear facets that also suggest that they could chew. So that's cool, and that requires lots of different types of testing to test that hypothesis. The second half of your question was which? The flat heads. So these guys, we don't know why they got flat heads. People suggested it's because they evolved into this kind of ambush predatory lifestyle. They're semi-aquatic. They put their eyes, ears, and nose all up on the roof of their heads to pretty much be kind of, you know, unable to be invisible, so to speak. And that's probably the main reason why these guys have gone flat. It's hard to say at the moment. Yes, sir.
The little tiny ligaments in our that go from the TMJ to our ear bones.
Yeah.
Are they just evolutionary remnants, or do they serve a purpose of some sort?
Good question. We don't know. I think in most of us, they're probably vestiges. When we're infants, they might be more important because the canal in our skull is much bigger. There's a lot more cartilage in there. There's a lot more quote-unquote wiggle room for those things to slide back and forth a little bit. As we get older, we do have evidence for the dentists and the oral surgeons who've kind of chased us down do show that they become fairly vestigial. They become immobile, and that hole kind of closes up quite a bit once we get older. But there's this whole intermediate space where we really don't know how important they are to our daily life, and so it's hard to say whether they're truly vestigial or not. But in possums, they're really big, and it's likely in possums there is a dynamic regulation between the ear ossicles vibrating and the discs and muscles mediating that. Because we have muscles that attach to our ossicles also that help dampen sounds. And when you paralyze the nerves that control those muscles, sounds come in very loudly on us, and it makes life really challenging. And so we have little dampener muscles up there already, and it's possible that this system might just be another system alongside of that. Hard to say at the moment.
Since the T-Rexes have bigger ear bones, can they hear better?
Oh, yeah. So that's a good question. So that ear bone, the quadrate, T-Rexes and reptiles really only have one ear bone. It's called the stapes. We still have it also. It's also known as a stirrup. But their stapes is this really long thing. So a T-Rex ear bone is like that long, but it's thinner than a soda straw. Those things we're not supposed to use anymore. And it's actually a really interesting question how that works, because a T-Rex head is this wide, and the stapes is about that long on each side. All right, so the eardrum is kind of out here, the little internal eardrum, so to speak, is here, and they hear by this really long soda straw vibrating, and we don't know how that works. We don't know how it doesn't break. And then the quadrate bone helps as an anchor for that. They kind of articulate with one another, but only through like a little ligament from what we can tell. So it's unclear if that quadrate bone really helps with true hearing or helps maybe insulate some really, high vibrations from that. We don't really know. Nobody's really done T-Rex hearing yet. We know that they can probably smell really well, and they can probably see really well, but we haven't really tackled hearing yet. It's a good question, though. You can come do it. We're ready. We have the ways to do it, actually. It just takes a person.
Alrighty, if there are no other questions, we'll have another round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you. Sorry for going long. Ooh, sorry, I went long, didn't I? Ooh, yeah.